Miriam Holloway had always believed that life could flourish in darkness. It was a lesson she had learned as a girl, watching her grandmother coax medicine from the forest floor, gathering the pale fungi that grew in rotting logs and damp hollows. The things that grow without sun, her grandmother had told her, are often the most nourishing. It was a strange inheritance for a woman of the Montana frontier. But in the summer of 1890, when the crops withered and the supply wagons stopped, and the people of Bitter Creek began to understand what true hunger meant, that strange inheritance would prove to be the difference between survival and death. She had arrived in Bitter Creek in the spring of 1888, a widow of 41 with weathered hands and knowing eyes. Her husband, Thomas, had been a physician in Ohio, and she had served as his nurse for 18 years. She knew the names of bones and the courses of fevers. She knew which plants healed and which ones killed. When Thomas succumbed to pneumonia in the winter of '87, she sold everything they owned, purchased a sturdy chestnut mare named Penny, and set out for the territories with nothing but her medical knowledge and a leather satchel full of dried specimens. Bitter Creek was a mining town, carved into the foothills of the Absaroka Range. Silver had been discovered there in 1882, and men had flooded in seeking fortune. Where men gathered, commerce followed. Saloons and general stores, a blacksmith and a livery, a small church with a crooked steeple. The town was rough but prosperous, its economy flowing from the dark tunnels that Archibald Vance had bored into the mountainside. Vance was the undisputed king of Bitter Creek. He owned the mine, the mining company store, and most of the land worth owning. He was a lean man with a gray beard and eyes like flint, who had made his fortune by working men hard and paying them little. The miners bought their supplies on credit from his store, at prices he set, and most of them owed him more than they would ever earn. It was a common arrangement in mining towns, and Vance saw no reason to question its morality. Miriam did not come to Bitter Creek for silver. She came because she had noticed something during her journey through the territory, a series of natural limestone caves in the hills east of town, their mouths half hidden by scrub pine and serviceberry. She had explored them carefully, lantern in hand, and found what she had hoped to find: cool, damp chambers with temperatures that held steady regardless of the season, with the rich organic soil of centuries of bat guano coating the floors. Perfect conditions for mushrooms. Her plan seemed mad to anyone who heard it. She would cultivate mushrooms underground, growing them in the caves on beds of straw and manure and sawdust. She had studied the methods in agricultural pamphlets sent from the East, where mushroom houses were becoming fashionable among market gardeners. But those operations required expensive buildings with careful temperature control. Miriam had realized that the caves provided all of that naturally, free of charge. She filed a claim on 40 acres of rocky, worthless land that included the cave system. The claim cost her $8. The land office clerk shook his head as he stamped the papers. "Nothing grows out there, ma'am," he said. "Not even grass." "I am not interested in grass," Miriam replied. "Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the mountains, the plains, or somewhere the wind blows just as cold, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the crisis finally arrives." Word of the widow's peculiar enterprise spread through Bitter Creek with the speed of all small-town gossip. She was growing mushrooms in a cave. The very idea was so outlandish that it became a source of endless amusement. Archibald Vance himself addressed the matter at his store one afternoon, surrounded by miners and merchants who hung on his every word. "The widow Holloway," he pronounced, "has taken leave of her senses. She means to farm fungus in a hole in the ground. Fungus, the stuff that grows on dead things, the stuff we scrape off our boots." He shook his head with theatrical pity. "I suppose when a woman loses her husband, the grief can addle the mind." The miners laughed. They needed to laugh. Their lives were hard, their work dangerous, and mockery of others was one of the few entertainments they could afford. The caves soon had a name: Holloway's Rot Pit. "You heard about the rot pit?" became a common greeting in the saloons. "The widow's growing toadstools for supper. Reckon she'll be eating poison by autumn." Even the women of Bitter Creek, who might have been expected to show some solidarity, kept their distance. Mrs. Vance, the mine owner's wife, organized a sewing circle that met every Thursday afternoon. Every woman in town was invited, except Miriam. Mushrooms, Mrs. Vance would sniff, as if the very word were an obscenity. "My husband says they're barely fit for pigs." Miriam heard the whispers. She saw the smirks. She simply continued her work. The preparation of the caves took 3 months of hard labor. She cleared the debris from the largest chamber, hauling rocks and fallen branches out by hand and by horse. Penny proved invaluable, dragging sledges loaded with materials up the rocky trail to the cave mouth. Miriam installed wooden racks along the walls, simple frames that would hold the growing beds. She gathered straw from a farmer 20 miles distant, manure from the livery stable in town, and sawdust from the small lumber mill on the creek. The growing medium was prepared with scientific precision. She had learned from her pamphlets that mushrooms required a specific balance of materials, properly composted and pasteurized to kill competing organisms. She built a small fire pit outside the cave entrance, where she heated water in a great iron kettle, using the steam to treat the straw and manure before mixing them into beds. The spawn, the living mycelium from which mushrooms would fruit, she had ordered by mail from a cultivator in Pennsylvania. It arrived in a wooden crate packed with sawdust, small white threads of life barely visible within. She inoculated each bed carefully, then covered them with damp burlap and waited. The first flush of mushrooms emerged 6 weeks later. They were beautiful, pale caps the size of silver dollars pushed up through the dark substrate, their gills as delicate as lace. Miriam harvested them gently, twisting each one free at the base, placing them in wicker baskets lined with clean cloth. The smell was earthy and clean, like rain on forest soil. She brought them to market on a Saturday morning, setting up a small table near the general store. The response was immediate and hostile. "You expect folks to eat cave slime?" a miner called out, to general laughter. "I wouldn't feed those to my hogs," another man declared. No one bought a single mushroom. By noon, Miriam packed up her baskets and returned to her claim. But she did not despair. She had expected resistance. She would simply wait. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. Through the autumn of 1888 and the winter that followed, Miriam refined her methods. She experimented with different substrate mixtures, different harvesting schedules, different strains of spawn. Her caves produced mushrooms continuously, regardless of the weather outside. While blizzards howled across the Montana mountains, her underground chambers remained a steady 52 degrees, and the mushrooms kept growing, She ate what she could not sell, which was nearly everything. Fried in butter, simmered in cream, dried for storage, she learned 100 ways to prepare them. Her health remained robust. Her energy never flagged. The mushrooms, she realized, were more nourishing than she had imagined. She also began preserving them in earnest. Sliced thin and dried over low heat, the mushrooms became leathery strips that would keep for months, perhaps years. She strung them on thread and hung them from the rafters of her small cabin, rows upon rows of preserved food that required no salt, no smoke, no ice. By the spring of 1889, she had accumulated a substantial reserve, and she continued to grow more. The townspeople continued to mock her, though the intensity had faded somewhat. The rot pit had become simply part of Bitter Creek's landscape, another eccentricity to shake one's head at. Miriam Holloway was the mushroom widow, harmless but peculiar. The summer of 1889 was dry. The summer of 1890 was worse. The rains that should have fallen in May never came. June brought hot winds that sucked the moisture from the soil. By July, the creek for which the town was named had slowed to a trickle. The gardens withered. The hayfields turned brown and brittle. Ranchers in the valley watched their cattle grow thin on parched grass. The crops failed entirely. This was not merely a local misfortune. The drought stretched across Montana and into the Dakotas, Wyoming, and beyond. The railroads, which had connected Bitter Creek to the wider world, suddenly had little to transport. What food existed commanded prices that working men could not afford. Archibald Vance's company store, which had always charged premium prices, now charged impossible ones. A sack of flour that had cost $2 in spring cost $8 by August. Salt pork, beans, cornmeal, everything climbed beyond reach. The miners, already in debt to Vance, sank deeper. They could not afford to eat. They could not afford to leave. The first deaths came in September. An elderly couple, the Mullers, were found in their cabin. They had simply stopped eating, unwilling to burden their children with another 2 mouths to feed. A week later, a miner's infant daughter succumbed to what the town's only doctor called wasting sickness. Everyone knew what that meant: starvation. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. In her caves, Miriam Holloway worked by lantern light. The drought that had devastated the surface world meant nothing underground. The temperature remained constant. The humidity, fed by the slow seep of groundwater through limestone, remained perfect. The mushrooms grew as they had always grown, oblivious to the catastrophe above. She had 3 chambers in full production now, their racks heavy with pale, fleshy caps. She harvested daily, filling basket after basket. Her cabin was festooned with drying strings, hundreds of pounds of preserved mushrooms hanging from every beam. She had watched the town suffering from a distance, unsure how to proceed. These were the people who had mocked her, shunned her, called her mad. They had laughed at her caves and refused to buy her harvest. Now they were starving, and she had food. There was no question, really. There never had been. On a cool morning in late September, Miriam loaded her wagon with fresh mushrooms and drove into Bitter Creek. She set up her table in the same spot she had occupied 2 years before, near the general store. But this time, she did not offer them for sale. A hand-lettered sign read, "Free. Take what you need." The first to approach were the children, gaunt, hollow-eyed children whose parents had taught them to mock the mushroom widow. They stared at the pale fungi with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Go on," Miriam said gently. "They're good. They'll fill your belly." A little girl, no more than 6, reached out a trembling hand and took one. She bit into it raw, and her eyes widened. She chewed, swallowed, reached for another. Word spread. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered. Miners, merchants, women, children. The entire hungry population of Bitter Creek assembled before her table. Miriam distributed her harvest with calm efficiency, ensuring that each family received a fair portion. "How do we cook them?" a woman asked, staring at the strange, pale things in her hands. "Any way you like," Miriam said. "Fry them in a bit of fat if you have it. Boil them in water for soup if you don't. Dry them over your stove and they'll keep for months." She returned to her caves and harvested more and more and more. For 8 weeks, Miriam Holloway fed Bitter Creek. She rose before dawn each day, descending into her underground chambers to gather the night's growth. She loaded her wagon and made the journey into town, distributing her harvest to whoever came. When the fresh mushrooms ran low, she brought out her dried reserves, the accumulated surplus of 2 years of patient cultivation. The caves, which had seemed a foolish hobby, now revealed their true value. They could produce food continuously, independent of weather, independent of season, independent of the disasters that had laid waste to conventional agriculture. While the fields lay fallow and the garden stood dead, the rot pit flourished. 63 people survived that autumn on Miriam's mushrooms. Without them, the doctor later estimated, at least half would have perished. The first supply train arrived in early November, its cars loaded with emergency provisions, organized by the territorial government. By then, the worst was over. The people of Bitter Creek had survived. A town meeting was called for the following week. It was held in the church with the crooked steeple, the largest building in Bitter Creek. Every surviving resident attended. Archibald Vance rose first to speak. The famine had changed him. His lean frame was leaner still, his flint eyes softer. He had watched his workers starve while his store sat empty, and something in him had broken. "I have been a hard man," he said, his voice rough. "I told myself it was business, just business, the way things are done. But when the hunger came, my business meant nothing. My silver meant nothing. I had no food to give. I could only watch." He turned to where Miriam sat, alone as always, in the back pew. "Mrs. Holloway," he continued, "I laughed at your caves. I called you mad. I encouraged others to scorn you. And when we were dying, you fed us. You fed us with the very thing we mocked." His voice cracked. "I have no words sufficient to express my shame. I only have my gratitude and my apology." He sat down heavily. For a long moment, no one else moved. Then Mrs. Vance stood. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "I excluded you from our sewing circle," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said mushrooms were fit only for pigs. I was cruel, and I was wrong, and I am sorry." One by one, others rose. The miners who had laughed, the merchants who had sneered, the women who had whispered. Each one offered their confession, their apology, their thanks. When they had finished, Miriam Holloway rose from her seat. The church fell silent. "I did not grow mushrooms to prove a point," she said quietly. "I grew them because my grandmother taught me that life can flourish in darkness. I grew them because I knew that the sun does not shine forever, and that wise people prepare for its absence. She looked around the room at the faces of those who had scorned her and those who had survived because of her. You ask for my forgiveness. You have it. You have always had it. Cruelty comes from ignorance, and ignorance can be cured. She paused. What matters now is what we do with the lesson. The caves are there. The methods can be taught. Let us make certain that Bitter Creek never starves again. Thank you for watching this story about Miriam Holloway and the mushroom caves of Bitter Creek. In times of plenty, unusual ideas are mocked. In times of scarcity, they become salvation. If this story reminded you that wisdom often grows in unexpected places, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been laughed at for preparing in ways others didn't understand? The winter of 1890 to 1891 saw the construction of 3 additional cultivation caves in the hills around Bitter Creek. Miriam supervised each one, teaching the methods she had refined over 3 years of solitary experimentation. She showed them how to prepare the substrate, how to maintain humidity, how to harvest without damaging the delicate mycelium. Archibald Vance funded the expansion from his own diminished fortune. It was, he said, the first honest investment he had ever made. The phrase, growing in darkness, became common in Bitter Creek. It meant finding sustenance where others saw only waste, creating value where others saw only shadow. It was spoken with respect, almost reverence. Miriam Holloway never married again. She lived in her small cabin near the original caves until her death in 1914 at the age of 67. She was buried on the hillside overlooking the entrance to her first cultivation chamber, beneath a simple stone marker. The caves continued to produce mushrooms for another 40 years, feeding not just Bitter Creek, but the surrounding territory. When the railroad finally made fresh produce more accessible, the old caves were gradually abandoned, their racks left to rot, their purpose forgotten. But in the Bitter Creek Historical Society, a small museum housed in the old church with the crooked steeple, there is a display dedicated to the famine of 1890. At its center is a wicker basket, carefully preserved, and a faded photograph of a stern-faced woman in a plain dress, standing at the entrance to a limestone cave. The plaque beneath reads, "Miriam Holloway, she fed us in darkness." Her grandmother would have understood.